Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Sorry, I'm in Canada, so morning for me, I suppose. Good day to everybody else. Francesco Cavatorta is my name. I'm a professor of political science at Laval University, and I'm delighted to be chairing this wonderful panel at the 8th edition of the Mediterranean Dialogues. The panel today is going to be discussing the Tunisian constitutional referendum that took place just a few days ago, and to discuss where the country is now heading after this referendum. With us on this panel, we have Professor Emna Benarab at the University of Sfax. Welcome, Emna. We have Giulia Cimini, who's assistant professor at the University of Bologna in Italy. And then we have Sarah Yerkes, senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. They all have been writing and doing research on Tunisia, about Tunisia for quite some time. So I'm delighted to have these three experts with me today to discuss what is certainly an important moment in the history of Tunisian political life. It has been now, the referendum has now been held. The constitution has been, the new constitution that replaces the one approved in 2014 has been approved. Professor Saïed, President Saïed, it seems to be kind of maybe consolidating his power, because the constitution was approved with over 90% of favorable votes, although participation was very, very low. The idea is, well, what happens next? Tunisia finds itself in the midst of a political crisis, finds itself in the midst of an economic crisis. The consequences of the COVID-19 lockdowns have been significant. The war in Ukraine has also had an impact on imports. There are some food shortages in the country as we speak. The transition basically that seemed to have succeeded, that many had pinned hopes on Tunisia being the first finally consolidated Arab democratic country. Well, all those hopes, I don't want to say they have been shattered, but certainly have been put under severe stress. And as I said, we have three experts with us today to talk about all of this, and I'm sure that you'll find this discussion particularly interesting. I would like to start with Emna, in fact, and to talk about a bit about the referendum itself. You know, the numbers are striking in paradoxical ways, in the sense that with only 30% participation, so that's a very low turnout for a constitutional referendum of such importance, but at the same time, 90% of those who went to the polls approved the changes made to the constitutional text. What does this tell us about the support base that the president has today in Tunisia after being in power for over a year now?
Thank you, Professor Cavatorta. The referendum's results show indeed a paradoxical situation that reveals a complex political landscape. As you just said, we have a relatively low voter turnout of 30%, but a landslide victory for the yes vote. So around 94% voted for the president's objective to quote unquote correct the course of the revolution. So this vote, I believe, is more than a show of approval for the content of the Constitution, because as you all know, it was never discussed nor put to public debate. So most Tunisians, either out of disinterest, lack of time, or even distaste for all things political, know nothing about the new text except for some sketchy readings here and there, especially in social media. So this referendum is meant also as a vote on the person of the president, as a vote on the popularity of the president. And it clearly shows that President Saïed is still on the winning side. The number of 2.6 million Tunisians voting yes is not by any means negligible, and is highly significant given that the president himself was voted in by around 2.8 million in the runoff election of 2019. So even though President Saïed lost some of his supporters and failed on several occasions to mobilize people to take to the street and a show of support for him, the number of those voting yes remains an indicator of the popularity of the president. So he managed to keep his base in place in terms of number, though not probably in terms of the nature of the electorate. This is what I call a moving base, not the same people who voted him in 2019 necessarily voted for the new constitution, but the number is still relatively high, with him remaining as a major player in a deeply polarized country. So how do we explain this? I think that what is worth noting is that Saïed's base is attracted by a populist, divisive, inflammatory discourse that is clearly still appealing to his base, still appealing to many of the people who voted for him. And this base believes that only a strong man in power can turn the tide, especially when it comes to the economy. So, so far, they have given him the benefit of the doubt, but I think this will not go on forever if the daily life of the rank and file Tunisians does not improve. And as the situation is really worsening, I don't think it's going to be improved very soon.
Thank you very much, Evelyn. This leads me to another question that I will ask to Julia now. The president seems to have been governing in a rather oppositional, confrontational manner. It is kind of my way or the highway in many ways for him. He has alienated a lot of the political parties, a lot of the political class, civil society organizations as well. There hasn't been as much consultation as one might have expected, maybe in a democratic country, regarding the constitutional referendum. And the same thing seems to be happening regarding the drafting of the new electoral law, where he basically declared a few days ago that he's going to do it by himself with the ones who support him, and is not really going to listen to the opposition, or to the opposition parties and to civil society organizations that might be opposed to him. So, Julia, what is their role then now of these opposition parties and civil society organizations? How can they find some room to maneuver and be influential, or conversely, how maybe they can decide that this is not worth their time and decide not to participate, even maybe boycott the elections?
Thanks, Professor Cavatorta, and first of all, thanks to the Med Secretariat, to ISPI, and all those who join us today. Well, let's say that indeed this way of doing politics is quite a novelty for Tunisia after 2011, especially if we consider that the so-called politics of consensus has been the trademark of post-2011 Tunisia's transition. But Saïed has never made a secret of his aversion to political parties, considered to be a symbol of failure, a symbol of corruption, and indeed his popularity capitalized on a widespread discontent among the population towards the political class. So political parties basically continue to be troublesome, somehow, and ill-tolerated. Recently, Saïed actually has claimed that they are doomed to disappear. And as for civil society organizations that you mentioned as well, actually they are persona non grata, like political parties, at least some of them. Not so long ago, indeed, Saïed announced his willingness, for instance, to cut off foreign funding to civil society organizations that are considered now to be a sort of long arm of foreign powers. So looking only at the most recent events, this hostility is evident precisely in the substantial exclusion of politicians, political parties in general, and also some key civil society organizations like the Tunisian General Union, who boycotted the so-called consultative commission in charge of drafting the law. So their role is somehow likely to be further downside. Suffice it to mention that in the electoral law reform project ahead of December scheduled elections, Saïed said that he wants to replace the party list system with individual candidate list in order to to decrease the party leadership's power. Also, he expressed the desire for recalling elected officials should they fail in their duties, a possibility that actually is already enshrined in the new constitution at the Article 61, but needs to be further clarified and implemented in the legislation. For sure, there are parties that are trying to call to unity in order to create a sort of front to hold this backsliding somehow. But there are also other parties, and now I'm thinking, for instance, to the party of Abir Musi, who also are trying to carve a space, a niche for their own political gains. So the situation at the moment is quite not only unstable, I would say, but unfortunately, opposition parties and Nahda, the Islamist-oriented party, first of all, seems not able to unify their ranks in order to find a solution, although a number of other actors, and now I'm thinking especially to the UGTT, the Tunisian General Labour Union, are trying to call to unify different social and political actors.
Thank you very much, Julia. Thank you. This, in fact, what you were talking about kind of goes to the heart of the debate that we've all had and Tunisians have had among themselves for the last 12 to 14 months. In a way, democracies seem to have been consolidated, but now we find this president who seems to disregard the democratic procedures. Is very confrontational, and some have talked about a constitutional coup in 2021. Sarah, is this the end of Tunisian democracy, or is the president in some ways correct in analyzing what were the shortcomings of the political system that was put in place, and therefore maybe the need for some more, let's say, direct action on the part of the executive? I know Tunisians themselves, I suppose, are divided on this question as well. What is your take? What is your take on this as a fine analyst of the country?
Thank you so much for having me. I think first we need to look at the political context that set everything up for July 25th. And there's no question that at that point, the political system was in disarray. The 2019 elections brought to power the most fractured parliament that Tunisia had seen, where the largest party, Ennahda, only had about a quarter of the seats. We also saw a large uptick in the number of independents and small parties and groups, with a lot of the seats being held by groups with only 1, 2, or 3 seats. And on top of that, you had growing polarization on both sides of the political spectrum, with parties representing more extreme viewpoints than in the past, sitting in parliament with relatively large blocs compared to the polarization of the parliament. Parliament really, was spending more time fighting than governing, and was not able or willing to enact much needed economic and political reforms. The government was also failing at that time to get the pandemic under control. So that's sort of the context that allowed Saïed to take the actions that he took. But all that being said, within the 2014 Tunisian constitution, there were mechanisms in place to address the political challenges that Tunisia faced. And so when we look at Saïed's actions beginning on July 25th, they were really without question unconstitutional and illegal. And in the 10 months that he began, he really succeeded in rolling back 10 years of democratic progress, putting in place the constitution that he orchestrated himself and really shoved through throughout an entirely non-inclusive and illegitimate process. And then finally codifying his vision of a third republic with this sort of hyper-presidential system where the president is above reproach and which eliminates pretty much all checks and balances. So I think, the political system was certainly due for a shakeup. And I think Saïed capitalized on the dysfunction of the parliament as an excuse to enact his self-coup and unravel the democratic transition to create this system that he had been advocating for long before he was elected president. This is not something that he came up with sort of on the spot. He'd been talking for years about wanting to have a more centralized presidential system. But also just to note that, the main issue he came into power to address was corruption. And he has done very little to address corruption in Tunisia. He's used the issue of corruption to punish his opponents, to go after the media, and he hasn't actually done anything to get at the root causes of corruption. So just then getting to the economic crisis very, very briefly, I don't think that Saïed is going to be the one that brings Tunisia out of this crisis. He's not at all a skilled economist, and he really suffers from a lack of knowledgeable economic advisors around him. And there's no evidence to suggest that he's going to be able to rescue Tunisia from its crisis in the short term. He so far has failed to secure an IMF loan, and we have not seen foreign donors step up in order to help him. So I do think it's not a black and white issue. There's a lot of room for debate here. But at the same time, it's very clear that even if Saïed wanted to reform the political system, he could have done that within the bounds of the Constitution. And he's a constitutional lawyer. He knew what he was doing. He actively chose not to pursue that path.
If I can stay with you, Sarah, for a couple of minutes more, because you mentioned the economy, and obviously since 2011, basically all polls, all analysis of the country suggest that it is socioeconomic inequalities that drive the majority of Tunisians to protest, to mobilize. The expectations, I suppose, of the revolution have been unmet. We have to be pretty clear about this. You said he's maybe not the man because of, maybe his confrontational style. The United States don't really like him that much. I think that Secretary of State Blinken has made that quite clear. But at the same time, the international situation has not been kind to Tunisia either. The war in Ukraine, the pandemic. If not him, then who? And what could he do to possibly try to improve Tunisian economic situations? Because he seems to be focused on quite a bit on, this kind of internal enemies or the ones who undermine Tunisian economy from within, but it's not really something that is very specific or very useful. It's probably part of it is probably made up. But is there anything concrete that he's doing that he can do maybe to be the man leading Tunisia out of the country, or is it an impossible task to begin with?
Well, I think that, right now, Tunisia is really suffering on virtually every socioeconomic indicator. And this is really setting Saïed up for a very difficult situation. They have this massive budget deficit and trade balance deficit that could easily plunge the country into bankruptcy and default. So they need support from the international community. We've seen unemployment continue to increase, poverty rates increasing, and the inflation rate, just the latest figures that just came out, it rose to 8.6% in August, up from 8.2% in July. And we're seeing the most vulnerable Tunisians suffering at a much higher rate than others. And many of these people actually make up Saïed's base of support. So this does matter for him politically. As you mentioned, the Ukraine war, that's had a big impact on Tunisia. It didn't create these problems, but it did exacerbate existing difficulties, including importing of food. Tunisia imports most of its grain from Ukraine and Russia. So this conflict has led to a decrease in grain imports. It's hurting the food supply. The shipping and supply chain challenges coming out of the war have led to shortages in basic foodstuffs and other basic goods. But there's also domestic issues that are contributing to this. And I think we can't just fully blame it on the war in Ukraine. Part of the problem is that Saïed's government itself cannot pay for the goods shipments that are currently blocked at certain ports. And so you have this problem where the shelves are bare in some cases, in part because ships aren't leaving Russia and Ukraine, but also because they're sitting there in the Tunisian ports and Saïed can't pay for them. So the IMF deal has kind of been seen as the way out of this crisis. And Saïed, I think, understands the importance of this deal. And in the earlier months of his self-coup, he really was sort of ignoring the IMF, trying to figure out what he wanted to do, and then shifted to this position where he put a lot of time and attention into the deal, and now has sort of stepped away from it. We haven't seen much movement so far. The deal, first of all, is by no means is guaranteed to happen, and it's by no means guaranteed to save Tunisia. The conditions the IMF is asking for are the same conditions that have been known for a decade. These are not new things. This is cuts to the public sector wage bill, subsidy reform, privatization of some industries. But these are also non-starters for the UGTT, the main labor union, as well as for large sectors of Tunisian society, again, including a lot of Saïed's support base. So while we have seen some sort of positive signs coming out of the talks, there hasn't been a lot of movement or a lot of actual tangible progress, in large part because of the intransigence of the union, but also because the IMF remains the biggest piece of leverage of the international community. And so what we've seen is the United States, Europe, and others are not willing to give up this leverage very easily without getting something from Saïed in return. And thus far, he hasn't been willing to sort of give anything up. So, I don't think, again, that he's going to be able to rescue Tunisia. He's, on the one hand, he's actually the best position of any Tunisian revolution, any leader since the revolution, to push through these IMF reforms. He is the state. He controls all the levers of power. If he wanted to shove through these reforms, he absolutely could. But on the other hand, he does need the support of the union and the public support. As was mentioned already, he's losing some of his support, but he does still have that base of support. If he starts to lose them, he's in real trouble. So what happens if he doesn't do this? I think, as it's very clear, Tunisia will be in deep financial trouble, and they'll need someone to bail them out. And that's what remains to be seen is, will the Gulf states step up? They so far have not been willing to give Tunisia support, despite Saïed asking them repeatedly. Will Europe continue to step in order to prevent higher levels of migration, in order to prevent instability? Or maybe China could help Tunisia out a little bit. They've been increasing their footprint in China and Tunisia. But so far, Saïed just has not been able to succeed either domestically or internationally in getting Tunisia to the place it needs to be to get out of some of these economic challenges.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Emily, if I could come back to you. Obviously, now with the new constitution in place, he has changed the institution. He has changed the institutional setup. Can you talk us through the changes that have been now made and that maybe will allow Saïed to kind of confront this massive crisis, particularly the economic one that is facing Tunisia? And what kind of major changes did the constitution introduce?
Right. So with the new constitution, President Saïed claims to be laying the ground for his new republic. But this new document is problematic on many counts. So first, because the process of drafting it excluded political participation and public debate. It is basically the product of one man's vision. True, President Saïed put in place an expert panel to draft the new constitution, but it only served as a rubber stamp for what it appears to be a very personal project. And here, I'd like to talk about the 2014 constitution. That constitution was also deeply flawed. It was tailor-made and created a fractured political system that led us to a political dead end and to where we are now. Nevertheless, it was hailed by the international community as a great success because, in part, it was the result of a consensual process. Anyway, for the new constitution, aside from formal flaws, including length, this is a constitution that has 142 articles, redundancy and circumstantial details, it presents serious problems. And here I'm going to talk about three important problems as far as I'm concerned, and as far as many experts are concerned. So one is that this text created an unaccountable presidency, a sort of an imperial presidency. The president is technically above the law. He has lots of powers. He appoints the head of government, and the government, he proposes legislation. And while Parliament could only propose legislation for the government to consider, Parliament would need a 2/3 majority to vote down any bill proposed by the government. And for Parliament, even if it passes, if it passes a no confidence vote twice during its term, then the president can dissolve it and call for early elections. So as you can see, it is a constitution that has left Parliament without any meaningful power, and also reduced the judicial branch to a mere function. Also, what is problematic about this constitution is that it allows the president's term in office to be extended in case of imminent danger to the state. And this is this expression, imminent danger, is open to lots of interpretations. And so, in this case, we can end up once again with a president for life. So the executive in this constitution is so powerful that we cannot talk in any way about checks and balances with the other branches of the government. The second point is Article 5 of the Constitution. I believe that Article 5 threatens to jeopardize the secularism of the state and society. It stipulates that the state would implement the intentions of Islam, and this opens the door wide for all sorts of interpretations regarding all aspects of life. This is, I believe, an elastic article that can be used to put in place a theocratic regime, as religion and the state are not understood to be separate according to this article. Also, this article can be used to reverse many of the family and women's rights and expunge previous social achievements gained over the years and codified in the personal status code. The third point is Article 24. Not many people talk about it, but Article 4 was shocking for many people. It implies and this article implies that capital punishment remains an option. It stipulates that the right to life is sacred except for extreme cases. This is not strange for Saïed, because this is in line with his campaign's rhetoric, in which he presented himself as a social conservative who defended the death penalty and other things like criminalizing homosexuality, etc. So I believe that constitutionalizing the practice of death penalty is really aberrant. That said, the major plus in this constitution, although this might appear as contradictory with what I've just said, but it's not, is that the new constitution did away with the parliamentary system, which proved to be a failure. The parliamentary system, as practiced by Tunisians in the last decade, exposed the incompetence and opportunism of the political elite. It exposed this to the public, which completely eroded people's trust in the whole system and discredited political actors, including political parties across the aisle, seen by Tunisians, especially by youth, as devoid of big ideas and unable to reinvent and renew themselves to something useful. And this contributed greatly, and I fear irreversibly in the short and medium terms, to weakening support for democracy as a governing system. So, talking about the institutions, this constitution created an imperial presidency. It created a bicameral system with no clear division of powers between the two houses of parliament, which could lead to further confusion. And actually, the intentions behind creating the district council, the one representing Tunisia's regions and districts, are not clear. Some fear that this might be, if you want, the starting point for progressively putting in place a bottom-up system similar to Libya's under Colonel Gaddafi, an idea really dear to President Saïed from when he was a lecturer at the law school in Tunis. Also, this constitution created or reduced the judicial branch into mere function. Parliament is a rubber stamp for the government's policies, etc. So what we can say is that the institutional architecture brought about by this constitution reflects the president's and only the president's vision of a presidential system.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Continuing on the issue, I suppose, of democracy being eroded, I think that there is kind of a consensus among large international NGOs dealing with human rights that the situation of individual freedoms has also eroded in Tunisia since President Saïed has come to power. Freedom House downgraded Tunisia from free to partly free. Is this reflected, Julia, in the reality that Tunisians live every day? Have these liberties been eroded, or if not, are they in danger of being eroded? Listening to what Emna just said about the perils of the new constitutional text, what do you make of the relation between civil society, basically? Because in many ways, civil society was a very active participant in the revolution, an active participant to the first constitution, the one that was approved in 2014. It has played a significant role in Tunisian political life. What is happening between, the institutions now in place, embodied by Saïed in this kind of imperial presidency, and civil society organizations?
Well, undoubtedly, after July 25, there was a crackdown in terms of political freedoms and individual rights, although this is a pattern that has been growing in recent years, and I will explain why in a while. But in particular, this downward scores on the extent of freedom mirror a number of measures taken by President Kais Saïed. So the most known are, of course, the decision to unilaterally dismiss the Prime Minister Hisham Shishi and his cabinet, to later announce a new government, swearing it without parliamentary approval, or the suspension and dissolution of the parliament, along with the repeal of lawmakers' immunity. But there was also, and this is something that more strictly concerned the population at large, there was an expanded curfew, a ban on public demonstration, and Saïed has relied heavily on police to enact the sweeping measures he introduced to counter corruption, to enforce house arrests and travel restrictions, as well as rounding up politicians. So all these measures targeted especially members of parliaments, but also lawmakers, businessmen, journalists, and bloggers. Just to give you some examples, in a series of high-profile attacks and against the main critics, there is the example of human rights activist and former president of the Republic, Monsef Marzouki, sentenced in absentia to 4 years in prison for undermining the external security of the state. And it was well known, actually, that his accusation against President Saïed. But also another worrisome trend have been the military trials for civilians. A recent example concerns, for instance, journalist Salah Atia, the owner and editor of Rai al-Jadid, on trial before a military court over comments against President Saïed and the armed force. And he could face up to 7 years in prison if found guilty. And press and media have been also among the main targets of this new wave of this new republic after President Saïed assumed far-reaching powers. If you look the last, for instance, rankings of press freedom index, Tunisia dropped 20 places, and one of the main press union accused the government of launching smearing campaigns against the reporters. State television, for example, is no longer inviting opposition politicians to voice their views out of pressure, or also by self-censorship. And reportedly, journalists have been detained, harassed, and intimidation normalized. So there are many journalists and also human rights watchdog organizations denouncing a sort of intimidating atmosphere. I can also mention another worrisome trend, that is Tunisia is featuring a pattern of police violence against demonstrators, with a sort of arbitrary use of tear gas, armored vehicles, or also arbitrary detention with charges of insulting police. And actually this is happening especially in the marginalized districts. That is also something weird, because Kais Saïed made it the cause of these most marginalized areas, suburbs, its own cause. But let me also add something, because all this did not start with President Kais Saïed. I mean, COVID-19 related emergency measures had already curtailed, for instance, a number of freedoms like the freedom of assembly. But even before that, there has been a growing restriction on civil freedoms or political freedoms after 2015, and in particular after 2015 counter-terrorism law and all the state of emergencies that have been enforced after that, because all these actually have been imposing increasing constraints on gatherings and give police broad license to arrest and detain people on security and terrorism-related charges. So my point is that yes, there is a deterioration in the last months of political and civil freedom, but this was an already ongoing process that current president is moving forward.
Thank you very much, Julia. I'll stay with you for a couple more minutes, because I wanted to ask you something about the relationship now between, after having talked about the relation between, let's say, civil society organizations and Saïed, I wanted to ask you something about the relation between the Islamist Party and Saïed. It has been, I suppose, front and center of discussions for the, certainly since he came to power in 2019. So now seems to be sidelined in all of this. We will have to see what happens with the electoral law, and then with the party's performance at the elections in December, if they take place. What is your take on the relationship between the two, and what can, I suppose, NACTA do, or what will it become if this imperial presidency that Emma talked about actually materializes for the foreseeable future?
But well, Ennahda has always been Saïed's archenemy, and Ghannouchi is notoriously one of the president's fiercest critics. But it is true that, especially in the run-up to the referendum, attacks against the leading members of the Muslim-oriented Ennahda party have intensified. And when I say attacks, I mean, of course, judicial measures against them, such as the freezing of assets in early July. Ennahda President Rachid Ghannouchi, who was also the former speaker of the country's dissolved parliament, had his bank account frozen by an anti-terrorism judge. Also other leaders were the main target of these judicial measures. But this has actually nothing to do with the issue of Islam or religion per se. There are a number of other factors that can help us understand this animosity, this rivalry, first of all, a clash of personalities, a competition over the same actually social base, that is a conservative social base, and also rivalry between conflicting and overlapping powers, at least before the current constitution. But despite its electoral downward parabola, and we know that Ennahda moved from 89 seats in 2011 with almost 30% of votes to only 19% of votes in 2019 with 52 parliamentary seats. Despite this, despite the fact that Ennahda has shown growing signs of internal weakness and disputes, Islamists remain by far the best organized party and a key challenger. And this is why actually Islamists have been and still are Saïed's main target. But of course, they are not the only one, especially because that notoriously Saïed is hyper-conservative in social matters. And Rashid Ghannouchi, for example, accused him of hypocrisy, of maquillage in the attempt to bribe Ennahda social base. So what happened actually, the constitution, the content of the new constitution, the constitution writing process, as I had the opportunity to write elsewhere, jeopardized not so much Ennahda or political Islam, but Tunisians, citizens at large. So to be at stake is, I would say, not really the fate of Ennahda, but really the fate of, or a fate of a single political party, but is really the fate of an entire country, especially because it is true that Ennahda is actually very weak, that Rashid Ghannouchi is one of the least trusted political leaders. And if I may say something, the party made a huge mistake in linking so much its future to the identity of one single leader that, of course, gave much to the party, but also the hostility towards Ghannouchi and his entourage mirror also translated actually into wider hostility towards the party at large. The point is that we know that Ennahda and the Islamists have proven to be very resilient. The origins of the party as political movement or as social religious association before that date back to the 70s. So they survived decades of repression, decades of exile under either former presidents Bourguiba and Ben Ali. So they proved to be very resilient. The point is now whether Tunisia's new democracy or Tunisia's new republic can prove to be as much resilient as the Islamists. What they can do? Well, this is a difficult question actually to answer. And I have to say that really we need to see the new electoral law also, because very much will depend also on that.
Thank you very much, Julia. We have talked about quite a bit, in fact, about the domestic dynamics, but obviously this crisis in Tunisia is not happening in a vacuum. There are international forces out there. Tunisia has Western partners. It is seeking alliances in the Gulf. It has alienated some of its neighbors recently. I want to go back to you, Sarah. You mentioned this a bit already in your answer, but I want to tease it out a bit more. What are the new? What is this kind of new political system? What kind of reaction is it drawing from Western partners? How, particularly the European Union and the United States, who are obviously heavily invested, or were heavily invested at least, in the success of Tunisian democratization. What kind of demands can they make? How far can they take their stick, if you want, against Saïed, both for the European Union and for the US?
Sure. So what I think we're seeing right now is actually a pretty significant split in the approach of the Western donor community. At the beginning, right after July 25th, 2021, we saw both the United States and Europe kind of taking this sort of wait and see approach to see where Saïed was going, where he was going to take things. But then, after a couple months after the measures around the Constitution, after, each step became clearer and clearer, the path that he was taking, you started to see a much more united position. And we saw a couple of G7 statements, for example, that were really quite powerful in pushing back against Saïed's actions. Didn't really sway him, but you did see this united voice, which got a lot of attention and really was a good measure of support for civil society, for the political opposition, for the groups that are still fighting for democracy. Now, where we are today is that on the one hand, you have the United States, which has taken a pretty harsh approach to Saïed's moves and really shown their displeasure, both by a variety of very high-level visits and very sort of pointed statements explicitly going against what Saïed is doing, but also by putting forward a budget for the next fiscal year that would cut U.S. economic and military assistance in half. And this has been stated publicly on the record that it's explicitly a punishment for Saïed's anti-democratic moves, with the caveat that should Saïed return Tunisia to a democratic path, more assistance would be available and they would sort of return to business as usual. But following this new constitution, we're not seeing the U.S. warm up and sort of change its position. We've actually seen some of the harshest statements coming out of Washington to date. And also, very importantly, there is discussion around the $500 million Millennium Challenge Corporation grant, which was approved just weeks before Saïed's coup, that $500 million could be taken away. It could be canceled in the coming months. This is a grant that is based on very explicit conditionality along a bunch of different criteria. And if you look at that criteria, Tunisia no longer meets the criteria that it would require to meet to receive the funds. So that money might be off the table. Now, in Europe, on the other hand, you've seen several EU member states being very vocally critical of Saïed's actions, but money has continued to flow. And this is largely because of the fear of increasing migration. And what we've seen is a much more of a concern about domestic politics in Europe, keeping the aid flowing to stem instability that would lead to more migration. But in my mind, this is not really a great path to take. I think, propping up Saïed's regime is not going to actually lead to the long-term stability that Europe and the United States are seeking. It's really in the long-term interest of Europe to push for more space for voice and accountability as a way to bring about stability and prosperity. Cutting people off, not giving them the opportunity to have a say in their own affairs is not going to actually lead to the kind of stability that Europe's looking for. So this is it's a real challenge. There are certainly trade-offs in both approaches, and you don't want to totally alienate Saïed and then not have any leverage over him. But on the other hand, actions that are taken to prop him up and allow him to keep moving forward on this anti-democratic path is not actually going to bring about the stability that the international community is seeking in the long term.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I'll go back to you again on international affairs. Tunisia needs allies. Tunisia needs support. Is the best way to go about it to alienate your neighbors in North Africa, as it seems to have done very recently? What are the relations like now between Tunisia, Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria? There's a regional context to take into account as well, particularly because if the money is not coming from the US or Europe, you will have to seek money from the Gulf, potentially, as Sarah already mentioned. So is the best way to get that to alienate the Moroccan monarchy?
Yeah. Well, the incident clearly announced a shift in Tunisia foreign policy line of conduct. Tunisia is moving away from one of its important foreign policy principles, and that's neutrality and non-alignment. Tunisia was one of the very first members joining the non-aligned movement created during the Cold War. So neutrality in Tunisia's foreign policy is a spirit and a founding principle. And regarding Morocco and regarding the Western Sahara conflict, Tunisia has always taken the same distance from both countries, which earned it the status of credible mediator. And this public display of shift in the line of conduct of Tunisian foreign policy toward abandoning its neutrality has not started with the meeting of Saïed with the leader of the Polisario, Ibrahim Ghali, a few days ago in Tunis, but goes back to last October when Tunisia abstained in the vote to renew the UN peacekeeping mission in the Western Sahara. And this abstention meant siding with Algeria and Algeria's position, which considered the resolution as being tailor-made for Morocco. And this position, Tunisia's position, was described by Morocco as a stab in the back and was subject to a fierce campaign by the Moroccan media. Besides, I believe that Tunisia today is caught in the middle of a restructuring process of what we can call regional mini alliances that are progressively taking shape. And at the heart of these alliances is the Morocco-Algerian conflict and the Algeria-Egyptian competition. Let me give you an example of this. An example that illustrates the emergence of these alliances. Morocco and Egypt are working to undermine the Arab League summit due to take place in Algeria next November. And this is a reaction to Algeria's declaration of its support for Ethiopia's Nahda Dam, which is seen by Egypt as a national security threat. So we have here, on the one hand, Morocco and Egypt, and on the other hand, Algeria and Ethiopia, and Tunisia is going to be once again put before difficult choices. And it is likely that Tunisia will side once again with Algeria, and this will further impact the crisis with Morocco. Even though yesterday the Arab League Secretary General mentioned that the crisis between the two countries is contained after the meeting that took place in Cairo between the foreign ministers of Tunisia and Morocco, I think the crisis is deeper than that. I think the crisis is deeper than to be resolved in a meeting between the two foreign ministers, and is likely to affect the relationship between the two countries for some time, given, as I said, the emergence of the alliances, and also as long as Tunisia does not revert back to its policy of neutrality. And actually, the rapprochement between Tunis and Algiers has become more conspicuous with the election of Kais Saïed, and this is for several reasons. Algeria is seen as the big brother who can come to the rescue of Tunisia in its financial and economic crisis. Algeria has recently provided Tunisia with a loan worth of $300 million, not much, but it helps, and expressed its intention in the last few days to stand up with Tunisia in its food shortage crisis, exporting sugar, biscuit, and other basic food items. There is also a mutual appreciation between both presidents, Tebboune and Saïed. Not a word discrediting the president's power grab or the new constitution was uttered. Despite as I mentioned before, and as you all mentioned, despite the serious flaws tarnishing the whole process. And actually, this is the attitude of all Arab countries. Also, Tunisia has taken some distance from Morocco due in part to the Abraham Accords and the normalization of the Israeli-Moroccan relations, to which Tunisia is hostile, to which President Saïed personally is hostile. So generally speaking, Tunisia is breaking with its policy of neutrality and is ceasing to be a masterpiece in the efforts one day to rebuild the Arab Maghreb Union by moving closer to Algeria and alienating Morocco. So this is a position that is becoming clearer by the day, especially since the election of President Saïed.
Thank you very much, Emna. We were lucky enough to have a few more minutes, and we have questions from the audience. And as it happens, they're kind of quite neat because you have more or less one each. So I'm going to go ahead and ask these questions that will relay the questions that the audience has asked. The first one is for you, Emna. You mentioned, again, this idea of the imperial presence, the very kind of direct attitude of the president. He wants to do things and he wants to do them on his own terms, ignoring in many ways the opposition and the pluralism of Tunisian society and the pluralism of the party systems. And do you think this is going to happen as well in the drawing up of the new electoral law? Is he just going to go ahead with this kind of gung-ho attitude and do it himself without listening to anyone? Or is he in a way forced by the environment to at least take into account what the opposition has to say and what rivals have to say about this new electoral law that is going to determine who's going to be sitting in parliament for the next 5 years?
Right. I think Saïed will make a grave mistake if he does not come up with an inclusive, thoroughly debated electoral law. I think this is not likely to happen, because the Independent High Authority for Elections said that such a law must be promulgated by mid-September in order for the elections to take place on time. But, until this day, we don't know anything about the new electoral law. Should he ban specific parties or personalities from participating in the December 2022 parliamentary elections, this will potentially undermine Tunisia's free political party system for good and trigger, I believe, instability whose way is being paved by economic hardships.
Thank you very much, Emna. Going back to the, there's a question on the IMF again, and this deal that seems to be on at times, and then it seems to be off at other times. It seems also that it cannot be done without the agreement of the unions. Now it seems that maybe it can be done without the agreement of the unions. Sarah, what is your take on that? I suppose, in a way, politically cannot be done without the agreement of the unions, without triggering massive instability, but at the same time, he's not bound by it, is he?
Yeah, the IMF has changed its position. Initially, they really were sort of holding hard to the idea that the unions had to sign on, that they would not sign, the IMF would not put forward any deal that the unions had not agreed to. That has really softened. What we now see is that the IMF would like the unions to sign off on the deal. They would like the union support, which they're not going to get. I mean, the unions, frankly, have not changed their position over the past decade. This is not going to change right now. So Saïed is in this really, really difficult position. I mean, my best guess is that he will shove something through, but then whether or not he holds the IMF or he holds up the conditionality, I mean, that's another question. In the past, Tunisia has agreed to certain IMF conditions and then just ignored them because they were not politically feasible. That very well could happen again. So it keeps shifting back and forth. But again, the IMF is not likely to come up with any deal in the next couple of weeks, and they're running out of time. If they want this thing to happen by the end of the year, something needs to happen today, and that's not likely to happen. The UGTT is pushing back pretty hard right now and is wanting to make Saïed's life pretty difficult if he shoves these things through.
Thank you very much, Sarah. The last question from the audience is quite in a way, it's a retrospective question, in the sense that it is asking whether maybe Al-Naqda made a mistake in moderating too much and seeking out the politics of consensus too much, that it kind of betrayed its very raison d'etre, which was to change the system and provide some sort of real alternative to the economic and social system in place at the time of the revolution. Is that really why the whole politics of consensus basically inevitably led to the arrival of someone like Saïed to power due to its populism in a way and due to the pretty fair accusations against the immobility and inability of the party system, and Nahda was a linchpin of this party system, to actually deliver on the expectations of the revolution. So basically, is Nahda to blame because they were too moderate?
I guess this is for me the question.
Julia.
Well, to be fair, the politics of consensus had both its pernicious sides and, of course, the positive effects. On the positive side, it helped the Tunisian transition to move forward during major political crises, especially, and Tunisia had many political crises in the last decade. But of course, the flip side was that this kind of agreement between opposing forces, despite being so political enemy, at least during the electoral campaign, did not allow to take much needed, especially socio-economic reforms, to to have the political, to be politically brave enough to take also difficult and unpopular measures, because at the end of the day, the result was this widespread perception that the parliamentary system, this consensual attitude, was the failure. And this led, in my view, to such a nostalgia of a strong man, with the idea that one single strong man or strong woman, because before Kais Saïed, we were talking about the possibility of Abir Musi to take power. So this idea that only one could be better than a group of politicians, and in this another has a responsibility. I think it cannot be blamed for everything, although it is very easy to do that. But it is a fact that actually the Islamist party moved from being a symbol of resistance, because it suffered at the hands of the previous regime, so it was very clean. It will symbolize a break with previous regime. So from symbolizing that, it moved to be associated with corruption, with a corrupted elite, because it has been one of the major player, if not the main actor, during the last years.
Thank you very much. It's been a great debate about where Tunisia is headed. I didn't kind of detect any real optimism in your replies, unfortunately. But thank you very much, Julia. Thank you very much, Emine. Thank you very much, Sarah, and thank you very much to SP for organizing this panel in the context of the 8th edition of the Mediterranean Dialogues. I am really grateful for your participation. I think that we have touched on the most important issues that Tunisia faces today. We obviously hope that maybe some of our catastrophic scenarios will not play out, but it is indeed difficult to see light at the end of the tunnel, at least in the short term, for the country, unfortunately. So thank you very much to all of you. Thank you very much to the participants. Thank you very much to the audience for their questions. And hopefully we'll get to do this again soon with, I suppose, better news to deliver to our audience. Thank you very much again.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.